Greetings ladies and gentlefish, and welcome back to another tank review. I haven't done one of these in ages, but I think I've got back into the swing of things just enough to be able to put one out without being a complete idiot, essentially. And we're going to look at the IS-6 today. Now, I have some old tank reviews going back literally years that are now quite badly out of date. So one of the things I'm going to be doing is going to update all of, well, not all necessarily, but update a chunk of those. Now, before I get into the review, I just want to mention I've tweaked how I'm going to do these a little bit compared to how I used to. So, firstly, as the game goes through patches and tanks change and whatnot, to try and keep track of that a little bit better, in the title of all of these reviews, I'm going to include the patch that the review is taken from, to make that a little bit easier to keep up with. Secondly, in the past I used to use some game footage from an older patch just to show a point. I'm going to avoid doing that now because I do think, even if the tank itself hasn't really changed, the game around it has, and I do think it's only fair to show gameplay from the patch about which you're talking. So, this is a patch, going to be a patch 1.10 review, and so it's only going to include patch 1.10 gameplay. Next, I know these tend to be longer format videos, so I'm going to put down in the description of the video timestamps so that you can go to the bit that is of interest if you don't wish to watch the entire thing, because these things can easily be like 45 minutes long. So we're going to be talking about, in order, a little bit of the history of the machine, some of the statistics of it, and compare it with some of its, let's say, competitors or closest comparisons. Have a look at the armour profile, a couple of gameplay games for you, and then just wrap things up with conclusions. And like I said, timestamps for all of those sections will appear in the description of this video. Finally, I used to do the statsy bit, where you just try and get an idea of what the tank is like from the statistics of it in the World of Tanks garage. My logic being that that is what players will definitely have access to, that is what we can all see, and the idea was to try and draw what information you could from that. The problem with that is twofold. One, Wargaming have decided to keep tweaking the garage interface, and these days, if I'm honest, I think it's overly complicated, and actually getting to the important information about a vehicle is more faff than it need be, and there are bits that get in the way. And secondly, and this has been the case since the game came out, there are statistics for vehicles that are good to know, kind of important, that Wargame do not tell you in the garage. They don't tell you in the game client at all. And so with those two things in mind, and because Wargaming's inbuilt, or World of Tanks inbuilt comparison tool is a little bit I'm actually going to use tanks.gg for that, as well as the armour profile. So just a heads up about that. I think that's all the preliminary nonsense out of the way, so let's just get on to it, and we're going to talk a little bit about the history of the IS-6. So for anyone who doesn't know, the IS series of tanks kicked off during the Second World War. They were named after Joseph Stalin, of course, everybody's favourite communist douchebag, and they were a series of heavy tanks that the Soviets brought out, and in part they ended up countering some of the German armour they encountered. And after the Second World War, the IS series of tanks continued. And we actually got many more variants of the IS family of tanks than were really manufactured. So infamously, you've got tanks like the IS-3 that came out after the Second World War and gave the Western nations a little bit of a shock. Now the IS-6 was one of these different heavy tank projects that the Soviets went in on, and the idea of this particular machine was to make a heavy tank with an electric transmission. Now this had been tried before during the Second World War, famously the Tiger P, the Porsche Tiger, that the Germans had been built around an electric transmission, and equally famously it didn't work very well. The story goes that the Porsche Tiger combusted when it was being demonstrated to Mr. Hitler himself, which didn't really go down too well, and as it was the Henschel design of the Tiger that went forward, and the Porsche chassis and turrets were reused in other projects. Now, the electric transmission for the IS-6 was kind of similarly successful. There aren't any well-known stories about it catching fire in quite such a spectacular manner, but the transmission just wasn't very good. I think this is very much a case where the desire and the design of the team behind the project kind of outstripped the technology available at the time. And so the IS-6 was deemed a little bit of a failure. Just to really rub salt into the wound, the tank was just overall considered to be inferior to its competitor, the IS-4. And with the IS-4 being a tank that would actually see production and was a much more conventional design and actually worked, the production of the IS-6 never really happened. Now, interestingly, the project name of the IS-6 is the Object 252. And if that sounds familiar, that's because in World of Tanks we already have an Object 252. It's the Defender. Now, as far as I understand it, the Object 252 that's in the game was a sort of sister project using a slightly different shaped hull, and I believe didn't have the electric transmission. But anyway, that's quite enough waffle about the historical aspects of the IS-6. Let's have a quick look and rundown of the statistics of this machine. So like I said, to have a look at the statistics of the IS-6, I'm going to use tanks.gg here, as it also enables us to make an easy comparison with some other tanks that are there or thereabouts. And I should mention at this point that the IS-6 in the game gets preferential matchmaking. That means it will never see worse than a tier 9 machine. It will never get into those tier 10 matches. And what you find with tanks that receive preferential matchmaking, they have that because of some other drawback about the machine. Often you find such tanks are more historical, or they used to be more historical, and have less sort of made-up guns on them, and so the idea is that they can't really hold their own against tanks that are 2 tiers higher than them. So when we're talking about the IS-6, you really want to bear in mind this is kind of a tier 7.5 tank in terms of combat effectiveness. It's a tier 8 tank with a tier 7 gun, sort of, so it's like I say, it's kind of a tier 7.5 tank. And so what I've got here, I've got the IS here in the first column to compare it with the IS-6, as the IS of course is the regular tier, or one of the regular tier 7 Soviet heavy tanks. The IS-6 here in the second column, the IS-3 as the, I guess, regular tech tree counterpart to the IS-6, or the closest that you get to that. And then the Chinese 112 heavy tank, it also gets preferential matchmaking, and because the IS-6 is often compared to the 112, although I never really fully understood the reasons behind it. It seems a little bit silly to me, but there we go. It's also worth pointing out that if you look at some of these statistics and think they seem a little bit off, or they're not what I'm used to, the IS-6 did receive some buffs some patches ago. I believe it was in late 2018, and they buffed the frontal armour, and various statistics about the gun received a little bit of buff as well. So, straight off the bat, we can see the IS-6 is actually packing pretty respectable DPM for a tier 8 heavy tank. It beats out all the rest of the competition in this regard, and actually that is one of the really nice things about the IS-6. With my setup, I get a reload of, I believe it's 9.6 seconds on the gun. So you've got over 2,000, almost 2,100 base DPM on a tier 8 heavy tank, which is a pretty good start. Penetration. The gun on this is essentially the same gun as that found on the IS, and it used to have exactly the same penetration, but those buffs that I mentioned Wargaming gave the tank meant that on its standard ammunition, the penetration went up to 186. Not a huge buff, but at the end of the day, a buff's a buff. The 112 essentially received the same treatment, but this is still not quite as high. In fact, it's nowhere near the 225 you receive with standard ammunition on the IS-3, and that 225 is pretty common across Tier 8 tanks in general. Now the IS-6 fires APCR as its premium ammunition, and with premium ammo you're looking at a penetration much closer to that of the IS-3. The 112 gets heat ammunition with that 250 pen, which is quite brutal. It's a way that the 112 can batter its way through some higher tier tanks, and the IS-6 just can't. 390 alpha across the board on these 122mm guns, and 165 module damage is the same caliber. You'd expect that to be the same, and as already mentioned, the IS-6 has a good rate of fire. Interestingly, the shell velocity on the IS-6's gun is a little bit different to the other similar guns. Now, the BL-9 on the IS-3 is a slightly different beast. That does get faster shell velocity, but for some reason, the IS-6's shell velocity is a whole 10 meters per second faster than the IS, and 10 meters per second slower than the 112. I'm not entirely sure if that is a historical feature, or if that is more a balancing mechanic. My money would be on the latter, if I had to guess. 37 shell ammunition capacity, something else that Wargaming buffed about the tank, which actually means that in terms of potential damage, it exceeds its other two Soviet counterparts in this comparison. It used to get, I believe it was 30 rounds of ammunition, which did mean that in your longer games you could find yourself running out of ammo. Aim time was buffed to a, actually, given the caliber of the gun, a fairly impressive 2.68 seconds, which beats either of the Soviet machines here, but is not and also beats the 112, though the 112 isn't too far behind. Dispersion was also buffed to 0.42, so that's better than the IS's gun. Same as the 112, not as good as the IS-3. That's a bit of a trend, better than the IS, not as good as the IS-3. Now, this is something they don't show you in the garage. These are the bloom values on the gun, so this tells you how much the reticule will bloom out, will expand while you're moving the tank or traversing the tank, etc. And these values are actually worse than on either the IS or the IS-3, and the same as on the 112. Now, I'm not surprised they're not as good as the IS-3, but I am surprised they're worse than on the IS. That did surprise me, I must admit. Then again, the better aim time does help account for that somewhat. On the turret traverse, however, the bloom values are better than the IS, though equal to or inferior than everything else in this comparison. And the bloom when firing the gun is also quite unpleasant, worse than on the IS-3, which does get quite good values in that regard. The elevation is 20 degrees, which is fine, and the gun depression is 6 degrees. Which is nothing to get overly excited about, but it is better than the IS-3. The IS-3 is quite a flat machine, and so it struggles for gun depression sometimes. So that does mean it has a little more flexibility than the regular Soviet heavy tank, and you can use your turret armour a little bit more effectively than its regular counterpart. Forward's top speed of 35 kilometers an hour is not as good as the 112. It's quite similar to the other Soviet machines here. This is not a fast heavy tank. It's not hideously slow either. We're not talking a mouse here, but it's not fast. Reverse speed of 14 is, I guess, fine. It's a 51.5 ton tank, which is the heaviest in this comparison, and at 13.59 the power to weight ratio is very definitely that of a heavy tank. Ground resistances are also not particularly impressive. While better than the IS at tier 7, they are, you guessed it, not as good as the IS-3 at tier 8, and also actually not as good as the 112, the Chinese vehicle, either. Wrap all that together and what you end up with is that the tank traverse is actually quite poor. It's worse than both the IS and the IS-3 and the same as the 112. We're going to have a look at the armour in more detail later on, because these numbers really don't tell the entire story. According to these numbers, the IS-6 has 110mm of frontal armour, 100mm of side armour and 60mm of rear armour, which on paper looks to be very similar to the IS-3, with the IS-6 having slightly better side armour. and very similar to the IS, with the IS-6 having slightly worse frontal armour and slightly better side armour, and the 112 appears to have the best of the armour in this case, but as is often the case with machines like this, angling is important. Turret armour, this is also slightly misleading. According to raw numbers, you're looking at 150mm on the front and side and 100 on the rear. The reality is the IS-6 is actually quite a well-armoured tank, but we will get back to that in a moment. 1,550 hit points is the highest in this comparison, but not by enough to really make much difference. And the module health is generally fine. The only other thing to really mention at this point, given that camo rating isn't really relevant for a heavy tank, is that the IS-6 does have the worst chance of catching on fire in this comparison. So that fire chance applies to hits that the engine receives. The fuel tank mechanics in this game are such that if the fuel tanks go red, you're going on fire whether you like it or not. The other thing that's worth mentioning here is that the view range is a paltry 350 metres. But if you've played sort of mid to high tier Soviet heavy tanks before, this shouldn't come as a huge surprise. They all have pretty abysmal view range. Shell cost is a little over 1,000 credits each shell. So that's just a quick rundown of the stats. Now, I mentioned at several points that that doesn't really tell the whole story, especially when talking about the armour, and so we're just going to have a look at the armour in a little more detail. So here we go then. Let's start off by looking at the hull. And apparently, it's supposed to have 110mm of frontal hull armour, and it does! Sloped back at 56 degrees, which is a very different kettle of fish. So the effective thickness of the frontal armour is actually around 200mm. There's actually a stronger section here, which would be kind of where the driver sits. It's actually 120mm, so an effective thickness of around 220. Now the lower front plate, if you're close to the IS-6, is 120mm. Again, sloped back, so you're looking at around 200 to 210 effective. If you're a little further away, that angle will flatten out, and so you'll get below the 200 mark. You have these shoulder pieces as well, still 110mm, but from the front these are angled back quite sharply, so don't even bother shooting them. Side armour, well, it's supposed to be 100mm, and it is, but again, it's angled at over 40 degrees, and actually, below this top strip, you then have spaced armour on top of that, and then tracks on top of that, potentially, and so actually, although on paper it's 100mm, in practice, you're looking at being 130 to 170mm without any additional angling. The rear of the tank is the stated 60mm and isn't anything to get too excited by. And, I mean, technically, there is a little patch that's 80mm here, but that really doesn't make any difference here or there. Turret-wise, well, again, technically, it is the 150mm that is stated, but then there's a big strip that's 190mm, there's a gun mantlet on top of that, and the long and the short of it is that much of the turret front of this tank is around the 240 to 320 This means that most of the time your turret is pretty good to bounce whatever's shooting at it, but because you do have some regions that are a little thinner, don't be surprised if you get, let's say, 200 pen shots. Pen your turret once in a blue moon. Side of the turret is also 150mm thick, but you're still looking effectively at about 165, so if you're a lower tier tank, shooting it in the side of the turret is possible, but depending on the penetration of your gun, perhaps not the best idea. If you're in a Comet, for example, and you're firing regular ammunition with around 150 pen, side of the turret isn't the best shot in the world. Rear of the turret, well, I mean, sure, go for it, it's the rear of the turret. Now, there are some commander's hatches here that are 150mm thick, but I have found, whilst it is possible to penetrate these, I have found in practice, this actually ends up being quite an awkward shot. Sorry about that, quite an awkward shot. And if you get round here to where the commander's hatches are rounded, then you can actually start getting some quite high values. However, if you do go for these commander's hatches and your shot goes low, then you can go through the roof of the turret, which is only 30mm thick. So if you have a 91mm gun or larger, you'll completely overmatch this. 90mm guns need not apply, I'm afraid. In terms of angling your armour then, in order to try and get optimal thicknesses front and side, you're looking at something around about this, and you'll end up with something along the lines of 200 and high 220s, low 230s, sometimes getting to 240 on about front and side. Now, this comes with a big caveat that this shoulder portion will be flattened out to 196 effective. So, guns with a penetration, let's say, higher than 200mm should, more often than not, be able to go through your shoulder portion. Now, this shoulder portion can also be a problem if you're attempting to side scrape. So let's say you're trying to come around a corner, doo-be-doo-doo-doo, and you're showing that shoulder. Let's say you've got a wall of some description covering your track. You're still showing a little bit, potentially, of that shoulder segment depending upon your angle. But if you're careful with your angle, to be fair, you can minimise the effects, and you'll still have like 230 effective armour. It's just something to be aware of. So, that's kind of the armour on the IS-6. Last thing I guess I should probably mention, in the same way that the roof of the turret is only 30mm thick, the top of the engine bay is 20mm thick. So in practice, if someone's going to have any sort of angle on you, or if someone's able to land a shot onto this engine bay from any old angle, it's going through. I mean, all the guns you encounter are going to be, the vast majority of guns you encounter are going to be at least 61mm. So, they'll go through. Artillery shots can also be a bit of a pain there. And actually, and I'll mention this again in a moment, because the raw thickness of the armour values on this tank are not stellar, it relies on the angling. This thing does not actually take artillery shots, or HE in general, very well. Anyway, we're going to flip back to the game client and we're going to have a look at modules and things like that. So just before we have a look at the modules, I did just want to briefly highlight, I mentioned the armour piercing penetration values, but I wasn't very specific earlier on about the other ammunition types. So with armour piercing, 390 alpha and 186 penetration these days. With your premium ammunition, which is APCR, 390 alpha and 225 penetration, up from it used to be 217, so about the same as your regular tier 8 tank with regular ammunition. Your HE rounds though, this is a 122mm gun, your HE rounds are actually pretty good, 530 alpha and 61 penetration, so that is something you can take advantage of here or there. And as I mentioned, this tank does not take high explosive or artillery shells particularly well, as it relies more on the sloping of the armour than it does on the raw thickness. It also leaves it vulnerable if your enemies get an elevated position on you. With that in mind, let's have a look at equipment, crew skills and stuff like that. So firstly, this is a heavy tank, so of course in terms of equipment, that specialised that specialised equipment slot is for survivability equipment. So really, if you can put a piece of survivability equipment in that first slot, you would kind of want to. And people can always default to your good old improved ventilation to buff your crew skills, and of course in this particular slot that will go up to 6% instead of 5% on your crew skills. Modified configuration, probably wouldn't bother. Don't get me wrong, the buff to your repair speed is nice. The increased durability to things like your ammo rack is nice. This tank does get ammo racked from time to time, and the decrease to your chance of engine fire is also great. But I'm not sure I would waste a crew slot, an equipment slot on it. I think there are better choices. Improved hardening, this is kind of going to be a very, very similar story. The suspension durability and increased load capacity and all that jazz just isn't really worth it. The increase to your hit points, 10% more hit points, 150 more HP, again, I don't think it's worth it. Now what might be worth it and what you can actually see I eventually went for is the spool liner. Now with the, if it's in your survivability slot, then an extra 60% of the HE shell damage is being absorbed by your armour. I need to be careful how I phrase that. Essentially, your armour absorbs more high explosive damage. Let's not get into exact numbers. And also protects you a little bit from ramming, which, as you're going to tend to be quite close to your opponents, can be useful. Extra protection to your crew from injuries, so your crew are going to die less, which is nice because your crew actually fall over quite a lot. And reductions to stun duration. So I played 50 games in this tank in its current state to try and give you an idea of what it's like for this review. About the first 20 or 30 or so I used improved ventilation, and after that I was just getting so fed up of both artillery hitting me, of my crew falling over, and just random people spamming HE at me, that I actually switched to the heavy spore liner. So try them out, see what you think works the best. I've gone for a spore liner because, my goodness, the HE spam was frustrating. Ammo loadout, I've got 26 AP, 8 APCR and 3 high explosive shells. I think actually you could probably go for a few more HE rounds and a few fewer APCR. That might sound a little bit odd, given that it doesn't take a genius to work out. The penetration on this gun is quite low for a tier 8 heavy tank, but I do find most of the time you don't end up firing APCR. The only time it really makes a difference is when you're up against other tier 8 heavy tanks, load the APCR, and you still need to aim for weak points, like lower front plates for example, but an awful lot of the time I just don't end up using it. It's kind of there as a just in case, but there we go. Anyway, back to equipment. I've talked about the spore liner. Other equipment you can go for, I've got a gun rammer to improve the DPM, and I've got vertical stabilizer class 1 to make my gun more accurate on the move and turret rotation and shortly afterwards. What other equipment could you go for? Well, if we have a look at some of the other slots, don't bother about any of this camouflage view range enhancing nonsense. You're going to play the IS-6 right in the enemy's face. They're going to know where you are, and your view range is terrible anyway, so don't waste any effort trying to improve it. Of course, the notable exception is improved vents, but if you're going to take that, I would put it in your survivability slot. Now, there are some interesting options in the manoeuvrability section of equipment, if I'm going to be honest, and I'm not going to be talking about special equipment here just to say I am going to be talking about good old-fashioned, boring, regular equipment. So if we're going to look in the mobility section, don't bother with the additional grousers, it's a waste of time, buffs to your traverse speed, it's just not worth it. And vents, of course, you could, but same comments apply. Now, the more interesting ones, I think, you could go for improved rotation mechanism, buffs to your traverse, and also that final effect on it, it acts like a mini vertical stabilizer. So I guess if you found the gun really frustrating and you wanted effectively like a vertical stabilizer and a half, you could go for the improved rotation mechanism, but I'm not sure it's actually the best use of another equipment slot. I think you're better off going for something else. Now, one option I didn't try out that might be interesting is the turbocharger. There are times when you want to put the IS-6 in an aggressive position, and this just helps you to get there. So that might be an interesting option. If any of you have tried out or end up trying out the mobility charger on an IS-6 or a similar heavy tank, do let me know how it pans out. We've already talked survivability, so let's just quickly talk firepower, and some of these we've mentioned already, so we're just going to mention the unique ones. Improved aiming, don't bother, just don't bother, I don't really see the point. Enhanced gun laying drive, there's better equipment out there, and we've already mentioned the others. So my recommended loadout, I think, would be either vents, rammer, vert stab, or, if you're really finding HEs getting on your nerves, spore liner, rammer, vert stab. And I should mention, even with a spore liner, I was losing crew members. So despite the fact, if you do take a spore liner, despite the fact that it should help protect your crew, I do not recommend dropping a first aid kit. If we get onto consumables, I do not recommend dropping a first aid kit in exchange for some other swanky consumable. In fact, if you were going to drop any of these three, so I've got a small first aid kit, a small repair kit, and a small fire extinguisher, manual fire extinguisher, sorry. If you were going to drop any of these three, For some other fancy consumable, I would say drop the extinguisher. I think in the 50 matches I played, I caught fire once, maybe twice, whereas I don't think I went through a single game without using both the med kit and the repair kit. Now, what I would say is that the large first aid kit would help against stunning, it would help keep your crew members in place, so that may well be a decent option for you to go for. Improved combat rations, a buff to your overall crew, that is lovely, but you're going to want to swap out the extinguisher for that if you choose that. And if you do that, you're probably going to have firefighting on your crew, and we're going to get to crew skills in just a moment. So for reasons I'm going to get to in a moment, I'm probably not going to recommend it, because you probably don't have a crew where you're guaranteed to have firefighting, unless you already have that, of course. You could, of course, go for automatic fire extinguisher and all that jazz. Lend-Lease soil, wouldn't bother. Remove speed governor, wouldn't bother. You're going to need that repair kit for something else, rather than just getting your engine back into gear. So if we do talk about crew skills briefly, this is of course a premium tank, which means you are unlikely to have a crew just for your IS-6. One of the beauties of premium tanks is that you can transfer a crew into it from a tank of the same nation and class, and without retraining they will work absolutely fine in the IS-6 with no penalty. So I've here got my Object 257 crew. I don't think I've ever actually played the Object 257. I've got it somewhere. It's probably right in front of me and I just can't see it. Oh no, because I've got tier 8 selected. Duh. Anyway, I haven't really played the Object 257 at all, but this is my Object 257 crew, or will be my Object 257 crew. And so that means that if you don't know what crew skills they're going to have, like you can't guarantee they come with firefighting, for example, then I wouldn't necessarily drop the fire extinguisher, and that goes back to my previous discussion. But what would I take? Well, your standard heavy tank skills, frankly. Brothers in Arms, Sixth Sense, Repairs, Snapshot, Smooth Ride, all the good stuff. The only one I really don't have here that I would recommend for an IS-6, I decided that I wouldn't do the normal thing I do and just go for safe stowage on my loader. I decided to be training up Adrenaline Rush, but the IS-6 does get ammo racked a reasonable amount of the time, so I would actually recommend safe stowage on your loader. But again, you're probably just going to be transferring in a crew from another Soviet heavy tank. 4-person crew here with your standard commander, gunner, driver and loader. Your commander, just to mention, doubles up as your radio operator. Now this doesn't actually really matter because most of the radio operator skills for an IS-6 are rubbish. So I'm not going to go into crew skills anymore. I think I've rambled on perfectly long enough at this point. Let's go and blow some stuff up. So here we go with game number 1 then. We're here on Erlenberg? Yes, Erlenberg, and this is an assault game. We are attacking, so we need to go over to their base and we need to take it. Now, if we have a look at, firstly, the map. Is this a good map for us? Well, it's okay. If we can restrict the fighting to these town sections along the banks of the river, we can do well. If the fighting becomes more open out toward the flanks, then that's where we might have difficulties. And in terms of the matchmaking, well, it couldn't really be much better. This is 357 matchmaking, we are very much at the top here. So if we have a look at the tanks on the enemy team, who are a threat and who we are likely to face, ooh, hello CS-52. The Patriot, or T-26E5 I should say, is of course a threat. Let me just put a shot into this guy if we can. I put a shot into him, he puts a shot into me, and I'm just wondering where he actually penned me. Tier 8 medium tank, of course, into the lower front plate, fair enough. And then there's a Panther. Scorpion can definitely hurt me. And then the rest of the team I'm not too worried about on the enemy team. Maybe the KV-2 large caliber HE rounds can really mess me up. So far, straight away, we've already found a fight and already put 2 rounds in, actually overall, rolling a little bit high for damage. And we're going to push forward. We've got support here from this STG, and we're actually going to work with him to be double tapping enemies. That's almost almost an 800 damage double tap. You can see us doing it there. I'll be the armor for this STG, and between us, we're going to put quite a lot of pain in on the enemy team. Hello, Mr. KV3, how are you? And STG finishes the guy off. This time I'm not quite there on the right page, and I'm not tanking the shots for that guy. Really need to deal with this medium tank on our flank. He doesn't hurt me, although he tries, and again we double tap the medium tank. I get tracked, STG does eat a shot, and I bounce some others that might finish that STG off otherwise. Gonna push along here, really want to clear these guys out. One into the Panther, STG finishes him off, but he takes a shot from the T-29 for its troubles. Speaking of that T-29, I mean, he's going to have a really bad day. He's got just under 200 pen with his standard ammunition, and so he's going to really have difficulty penetrating us. Ooh, artillery hit there for 206. Can you pick up the kill, Mr. STG? Not quite. And at this point I decide, okay, our team is pushing up. They should be able to deal with the T-29. The other side of the river is not looking so great. Worth pointing out, by the way, that we've already done 3,234 damage in under 3 minutes. Ooh, hello, Mr. KV2. That ends up being a very unfortunate critical hit. Spoilers. Thankfully he doesn't get a return shot into me. And we've blocked 2,145 damage with our armour and managed 285 assistance. Our KV-122 is dueling it out with a KV-85 on the enemy team. Can we pick out a shot on this guy? Oh no. The KV-122 pulls out in front. Team damage is no longer a thing, thankfully, but I guess that was a poorly aimed shot on my part, and the guy just bugs out before we manage to reload. So the scoreline is now 4-6. The STG has died. The T-29 on the enemy team died, thankfully, but this isn't looking so hot, so we're going to push round here, and I was in 2 mines. There's a bounce, and there's artillery for 261. This game, by the way, I did not have a spore liner on. So I was in 2 minds as to who to go for first. I decided it's best to clear out this KV-85 first, and possibly then worry about the T-26E5. And here I'm about to make a mistake. I could probably have already taken a shot here, but it's been a while since I played the game. I mean, but look at all this tank the KV-85 is showing me. I could have executed the guy here. I'm just going to show this in third person. But I don't take the shot because I'm not very confident. Instead, I give the guy this shot, which is a misplay on 2 counts. One, I'm not really angling my armour. This guy has 175 pen with his standard AP rounds from that 100mm gun, which is what he appears to be using. My side armour effectively is in the 160-170 range, but also because he's above me, he's going to be shooting down on me ever so slightly, which is going to remove some of the effects of the sloping. So really, I should and could have tanked this shot from the KV-85, but instead I take 222 damage, and then I get hit by the KV-2 for 292. Again, remember, I did not have the spore liner in this game. Now I decide to push up and finish off that KV-2. I'm going to put 1 shot into him here for 358, and oh dear, this could be a problem. The KV-2 takes me out. Now, if we actually have a look at what damage we took in that game, I don't want to focus too much on my poor play. I just want to look at the problems we were having. So we took a shot at the beginning of the game from the CS-52. That was just, I wasn't expecting him to be there that quickly, to be honest. Fair play to him, right in the lower front plate. We then bounce a whole load. We bounce, we bounce, we bounce. We then take 206 from artillery, 261 from artillery, that's 467. KV-85, getting round the sloping on my armour, and then 292 from the KV-2, so that's 470 odd, 670 odd, just basically 770, and then the KV-2 finishes off for almost 300. So we take about 1100 damage in that game from HE rounds. Just want to clarify that. Games like this is why I switched to using the Spall liner. Now, I'm not going to show you the rest of this game because that's not really relevant to the IS-6. We're 5-10 down, but spoiler alert, our team actually plays a bit of a blinder and they manage to come back from this deficit. So, let's go and have a look at the post-game stats for this one. Okay, so like I said, we actually won that game. The enemy base was captured. And that game ended up being enough for a second-class mastery and a fire for effect ribbon. None too shabby. We finished at the top of our team with 4,085 damage done, 1 kill and 1,045 base experience. The experience would probably have been higher, but in the end our team capped the game out rather than killing all the enemy tanks remaining. That KV-2R on the enemy team, he ended up doing about 600 damage to me with his 152mm HE shells, so I accounted for about half his damage all told. Shoutouts I would like to just very quickly put out to the enemy KV-85, 2k damage, bottom tier. Well done to you. The tier 8s on the enemy team really didn't pull their weight. The top scoring one was that T26E5, and even he only did 1,300 damage, which in that matchmaking is just not good enough. The Scorpion put one shot in and just died, and the CS52, who was over on our flank, put in 2 shots, and we just bullied him down. And our T29, SU100Y and SU130PM. At the end of that game, between them, they actually did very well. Also, Direct 10-1, good teamwork there with that STG as we were able to double tap those guys down. 14 shots fired, 13 hits, 11 penetrations, managing to keep the accuracy relatively good because we fought that engagement very close range for that 4,000 damage. 17 hits received, of which 2 penetrated, 1 from the CS medium tank and 1 from the KV-85. 11 non-penetrations. All the rest was high explosive of one description or another. 2,645 damage blocked by our armour, 1 enemy vehicle spotted, 6 damaged, 1 destroyed, 285 assistance. And with a premium account we actually made a, 92,000 credit profit, plus another 11,500 credits added to the reserve stock. There was no special mission going on at the time, that was just profit. It would have been 4,000 credits with the standard account. Bear in mind that we did do 4,000 damage, which is a good amount. Now, XP wise, don't pay too much attention to this necessarily because, we actually had a mission that buffed our experience gain there. But suffice to say, it's a premium tank, it's a good experience maker. So we made a lot of experience, a lot of credits, and we actually died 4 minutes and 37 in. So, in under 5 minutes, 4,000 damage, and about 100,000 credits. That's not too shabby at all, I think. That, of course, was with favourable matchmaking. Now let's have a look when things are a little more dicey. So, here's the second match then. Once again, map, and who are we against? So firstly, map Himmelsdorf. That's a good map. The IS-6 likes close-range engagements where people can't just get out of the way. Himmelsdorf, nice map. Also, protects you from all that blasted artillery spam. And now the matchmaking. This is a tier 9 game. And it's a very tier 9 game. This is, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 tier 9s on the enemy team. And then the rest of us are tier 8. This is about the worst matchmaking you're going to get. Now, I really don't want to go down Banana Alley or anywhere like that, because I don't really want to face an Object 257, a VK4502B, a Jag Tiger, a 53 TP, an E75 TS, a Lerva. You know, they've all got some actual armour going on, so I want to try and avoid as many of them as possible. So what I'm actually going to do in this match is I'm just going to pretend I'm a medium tank. Because whilst there are some scary medium tanks on the enemy team, the Centurion 7, Standard B, CS52, the Pantera, these guys can definitely all hurt me. They don't have a huge amount of armour, and so that means I can definitely hurt them. And so that's what I'm planning to do. And straight away, of course, the E75 TS, with its 1,000,000 horsepower, or whatever it is, actually manages to make it up onto the hill. Well, go figure, he's going to be a problem, but at least we bounced the first shot from him. And the 53 TP has also come up here. But aside from that, we've got a Centurion, a CS-52, a Pantera. It's the standard B. It's the people that we would expect. So, first things first. Hello, Mr. Standard B. Despite me saying, by the way, that we're actually on Himmelsdorf, artillery shouldn't be a problem, there we go, we get stunned by artillery. We didn't take any actual damage, though. Now, once again in this match, by the way, I'm using vents instead of the spore liner. It would be later on that I would end up using the spore liner, but the games I've chosen to use for this video were both from before I was using that. So we've managed to put one shot into the standard B, so that's a tier 9. 347 damage is a low damage roll, but even so, you know, we've hurt a tier 9. We've lost a VK, tier 8, and a standard B, a tier 9, and in return we've taken out a tier 8 light tank. Whoop-de-doop. Now, I didn't really know the E75 TS's armour profile very well when I took that shot. Having since looked it up, APCR to the lower front plate would have done the job. But I didn't know that. I haven't played the IS-6 in very long at this point. And I decide here, screw the heavy tanks, let's put a shot into the medium tank behind him. You know, heavy tanks are there to soak damage, so let's not let him. Now, I eat one shot from the Pantera there, which is a little disappointing, but never mind. And I'm just going to pop out, hello Mr. CS, and actually, along with the Centurion, we managed to double tap him. Our Centurion, by the way, does not have the top gun. That is a 20-pounder. So, who's next? Well, there goes the E75, and we missed the standard B. That's a shame. Scoreline's 3-5, by the way. This isn't looking particularly great. But this is the kind of engagement the IS-6 likes. Ow. Close range. Now, the caveat, of course, here is that more of these tanks can actually hurt me. I'd rather be farming tier 6s, but, you know, you can't have everything. And there's a 53 TP, another heavy tank we just don't really want to have to deal with. So I decide to pull back here. Scoreline is 3-7. And we're going to go around the side and try and help this 53 TP against the Pantera and the Standard B and the Centurion. Put a shot straight into that P44 Pantera. We lose our 53 TP, unfortunately, but there you can see I'm reloaded in time to put a shot into the Standard B. I take a shot in return. I can't bounce all of these, like, you know, tier 9 medium tanks have some respectable penetration. Hello Centurion. Shot into his lower front plate again. I take a hit from him. There's a tier 8 Pantera. I can actually bounce this guy, especially if he's just going to let me, well, wiggle. And we managed to kill him, but now it's looking a little dire. There's a Centurion. There's a 53 TP coming up behind me, but thankfully the 53 TP is firing HE. We managed to execute the Standard B, and then the Centurion puts us out of our misery. And we die at about 4.5 minutes into the game. Neither of these matches were particularly long. Not gonna make you sit through the rest of this, because again, it's not really relevant to the IS-6. But what did we do there? Well, we recognised, and it's worth pointing out that even though we did die up there, unfortunately, our team just melted. That was probably going to be one where we were going to struggle to win, because even in that, 4.5 minutes, we still did 3,000 damage in a tier 9 match. This is basically the worst matchmaking the IS-6 gets. So we identified that there were some fairly beefy tanks on the enemy team that we would like to avoid if at all possible, because our gun just doesn't have the punch to deal with them effectively. And we'd much rather go and deal with more lightly armoured targets, which is what we did. And 3,000 damage, 2 kills, and we still bounced 1,520 damage with our armour, even against a bunch of tier 9s. I don't think that's too shabby. I think we made a good account of ourselves. So once again, let's have a look at the post-game stats. So there we go. It did end up being a loss. Our team weren't able to pull that one back, but that's probably not going to come as a surprise to anyone watching this. We still got 3rd class mastery, fire for effect, and duelist ribbons. 2,985 damage, 2 kills, 594 base experience left us at the top of our team by either damage or experience, and by quite a considerable margin in both cases. Probably doesn't help that, well, 3 guys on our team did 0 damage, another 3, 4 did basically 0 damage, or less than 1,000 between them, and yeah, it's just not a great performance from our team. On the enemy team, the Lerva did well, the Object 257 did well, the mediums who were up on the hill with us did alright, but we gave them a bit of a battering. 10 shots fired, 9 hits, 8 pens for that damage count. It still took 11 hits to kill us. It's worth pointing out. 1,520 damage blocked by our armour, 2 enemy vehicles spotted, 5 damage, 2 destroyed, 448 assistance. Now, we did make a decent profit, but I would like to point out, one, those shells were about 1,000 credits each, and that's without firing any premium ammunition, so 10,000 credits on ammunition resupply. And two, that was a defeat, so expect fewer credits, but still a respectable amount there. With the standard account, that would have been 38,000. We were running a premium account at the time, so that was, what, 66, plus another 8 in the reserve. So there we go. There's the gameplay. Let's just round things off in the garage. So, what do I actually think about the IS-6 overall? Well, having played it, I was actually pleasantly surprised. I was expecting this thing to struggle in the modern game, given how long it's been since the tank was introduced and since I last played it. But honestly, it didn't really feel any different to playing it 3, 4, 5 years ago. So if you already own the IS-6, why not take it out for a spin? It might surprise you. You might enjoy it. The games tend to be quite swingy, but I always found they were. You tend to do very well in some matchups and on some maps, and really struggle in others. About the question of whether you should buy it or not, well, that's really a question only you can answer. If you don't own it, and you like the look of the gameplay that you saw, bearing in mind I didn't show any of the games where you just completely suck out, although there aren't too many of those, then there are a couple of ways to get hold of an IS-6. Firstly, you could buy it in the premium shop, where it clocks in at around £30–33, something like that. You can't get it directly from the tech tree, but you can get it from Wargaming's website, hence the premium shop. It's about the same as the other Tier 8 heavy tanks. I'm actually surprised about that, because it's a premium tank with preferential matchmaking, and I thought Wargaming were trying to expunge preferential matchmaking tanks from the game, but never mind. You can also get hold of the IS-6B, which is basically an IS-6, but with a black paint job, for bonds. And I don't recommend that. I think your bonds could be better spent on improved equipment. Or if you really want some quirky tanks for your bonds, why not pick up things like the IS-5 or the WZ-121B or whatever it's called. Some of those tanks that people don't see very much, but I wouldn't pick up an IS-6B. Not for bonds. So there we have it. The IS-6. I hope you guys found it vaguely informative and or enjoyable, and if you did, there should be various things cropping up on the screen for you to click on to go to other videos or to subscribe to the channel if you've not already done so, and I wish you very happy hunting on that battlefield. Ciao ciao.